Hello, I'm Maria Williams with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnership calls and webinars, news feeds, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's CHE EDC Strategies Partnership Webinar, which is titled Melamine, Scoping Review Reveals Potential Endocrine, Reproductive, and Neurotoxic Activities. Our moderator today is Carol Kwiatkowski, Executive Director of the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. We will leave time following the presentation for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions through the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentation. After the presentation, our moderator will read out questions for our presenter to respond to. We will get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speaker. This webinar is scheduled to last for 30 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Maria. Our speaker today is Ashley Bolden, who's been a senior scientist with TEDx, the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, since 2011. She studies endocrine disruptors using systematic review methods. She manages our TEDx list of potential endocrine disruptors. She's co-authored numerous papers, and she's collaborated on nearly every project at TEDx. TEDx's melamine research was inspired by our founder, Theo Colborn, who many of you know was a true visionary. When she began talking about melamine several years ago and all the potential exposure routes and the lack of information on health effects, it was clear that this was her incredible foresight at work. She was on to something big. Last spring, we began investigating exposure routes with Lizzie Grossman, an environmental science writer who many people knew and loved. So at TEDx, we're very proud to be carrying this work forward in their honor and their memory. And now Ashley's going to tell you as much as she can about melamine in 20 minutes, based on the scoping review that she conducted, which was published last month in the journal Toxicology Letters. Ashley, thanks for being with us today. The floor is yours.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks so much for the wonderful introduction, Carol. And thanks to the Collaborative on Health and the Environment for extending me this opportunity to share the recent work out of the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. I'm really excited here. And I really want to encourage you guys to follow us on Twitter at endo_exchange. Our Twitter handle again is at endo_exchange. So let's jump into the presentation. Next slide. So melamine is a chemical that is used in many consumer and industrial products. It has been used in laminates, adhesives, plywood, flooring, food packaging, dinnerware, and food utensils. Melamine has been very popular in those applications because it's very durable and inexpensive. You may even actually have a melamine spatula or two in your kitchen, or have eaten in a cafeteria that used melamine plates and cups. So, can melamine leach from those items? Well, it appears so. So we found a few studies that tested melamine ware under simulated household conditions. So this would be like microwaving or like high heat, some acidic conditions. And these studies found that both melamine and formaldehyde were able to migrate out of the melamine ware, which is really interesting. So next slide. If I can get it to go. Okay, great. So melamine really became well known in mainstream media starting in about 2007, when it was found to cause renal failure and death in pets in Canada, the US, and Puerto Rico. It had been added to the pet foods and treats to falsify the protein content. And even more tragically, melamine was also added to baby formula in China. And unfortunately, many infants and children died or became sick, also due to the toxic effects of melamine on the kidneys. These two events began a change in the melamine research landscape. Articles began to be published that suggest that melamine exposure might result in renal toxicity. And as you can see in the graph to the right, research in this area really exploded after 2008. However, next slide. This thing is like a little bit delayed. Okay. Perhaps one of the really interesting parts of this melamine story is exposure. And this is what we kind of found in our research. So based on the published research, it might seem that exposure was maybe due to a couple companies that wanted to falsify the protein content of their products by adding melamine, you know, the baby formula in the pet foods. However, the chemical has actually been detected in a variety of foods and appears to be an environmental contaminant. So foods that have been tested for melamine include dairy products, processed frozen foods, eggs, vegetable products, shrimp, and fish, and they've all been shown to have detectable levels of melamine. Even in laboratory studies, several common foods like corn, soybeans, wheat, milk, eggs, and muscle from livestock, so this would be like meat, can accumulate melamine. So although it is not really known at this time, like this is really unclear how the food is contaminated with melamine, we do know that one way might be through food preparation and processing. So, you know, we talked about the melamine ware, the utensils, the plates. But another plausible theory involves the use of the pesticide cyromazine. Next slide. So cyromazine is an insecticide that is used to control flies in manure. And this chemical can be used by feeding it directly to a livestock animal, and then it can break down in that animal and produce melamine as a metabolite. Further, studies that we found suggested that cyromazine can be converted to melamine and cyanuric acid, and those two chemicals, melamine and cyanuric acid, can actually have been linked to forming the crystals that were found in the children of the pets that had suffered from renal toxicity. Cyromazine itself can also be used directly on crops like beans, celery, onion, tomatoes, and leafy vegetables. And we found studies that show that cyromazine can easily be taken up by the roots and the plant and the leaves of these plants. So if you look in this diagram, for example, this is just theory here, maybe there's cyromazine containing feed that would be given to, say, for example, a chicken. And once it's inside of the chicken, it is then metabolized to melamine, and that melamine is transferred perhaps to the eggs, and the eggs could be eaten whole or added to other processed foods. Another route is that the melamine is transferred via the chicken manure into the crops, or the crops themselves are treated with cyromazine, and we have the cyromazine getting into the crops and producing this melamine in the crop. The crop is then eaten, or the crop is added to a processed food. Next slide. So at the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, we really started following melamine in 2011, when research was beginning to show that melamine might impact hippocampal function in vitro and in vivo mammalian models. So early on, we knew that there might be more to this melamine story because the hippocampus influences more than just memory potentiation and learning. So at that time, we really had no experimental evidence demonstrating that melamine might have other impacts, but it was just on our minds. We were just thinking, oh, well, something else is probably gonna happen. And then it did. In 2013, the first observations of reproductive dysfunction following melamine exposure were published. And this body of literature continued to mature, and the realization that melamine effects go beyond renal toxicity came to the forefront for us. And so, in 2016, my co-authors and I decided to move forward with a scoping review to study the non-renal effects of melamine exposure. So, what's a scoping review? Next slide. So, scoping reviews have been used in clinical and social sciences, but are relatively new to environmental health. What they do is they summarize and determine the literature available in an area of research. And scoping reviews can be used in the problem formulation stages of a systematic review because they allow you to determine the maturity of a body of evidence. They allow you to identify research gaps and to pinpoint bodies of evidence that might be successfully assessed in systematic review. So systematic reviews can be used to examine specific endpoints and critically evaluate multiple streams of evidence, including animals, like experimental animals, models, humans, and in vitro studies. These analyses can result in recommendations for further primary research, risk assessments, and exposure assessments. Next slide. So our scoping review aimed to describe the body of literature that had assessed the potential non-renal health impacts of melamine exposure. We planned to use this review to determine if the literature was mature enough to perform systematic review on a given endpoint, and to identify research gaps in order to suggest a few next steps to prioritize future research. Next slide. So after we developed the search logic, we carried out electronic searches in PubMed and Web of Science databases. And the potentially relevant articles were uploaded into Distiller, which is an online reference screening tool. And then 2 independent reviewers screened titles and abstracts to identify relevant articles. So those articles were they went into full text review, and we characterized the data streams, so like the human, the animal, and in vitro, as well as the endpoints of study among those studies. Next slide. So searches from PubMed yielded 2,849 records, and the Web of Science 9,362 records, for a total of 12,211 records. So that teeny tiny sliver there you see of the 43 are the relevant studies that we identified. And interestingly enough, 100% of them were published after 2010. And among those studies, 74% evaluated endpoints in vivo models and 35% in vitro models. In the graph to the right, you can see that anthropometric, enzyme and biochemical, reproductive, and neurophysiological had the most individual studies with endpoints relevant in that given category. But there's more to this than just numbers. It is really important to be able to identify similar endpoints within the category for possible systematic review. So in addition to that, we also wanted to identify mechanistic observations that might support the biological plausibility of the primary endpoints by explaining how these effects occur. Now, because enzyme biochemical findings provide mechanistic support, we decided to move forward with the endpoint categories, anthropometric, reproductive, and neurophysiological, as potential candidates for systematic review. These categories contained endpoints such as sperm production, memory deficits, and changes in growth patterns. Next slide. So this graph shows the number of studies on the y-axis, and you can see that each of the 3 endpoint categories all had animal studies. And for example, if you look at anthropometric, you can see that there was a single human study, yet 19 studies completed animal models, and a very clear gap in mechanistic support in this area, which is typically represented by in vitro studies. Next slide. So in total, our study identified 20 articles that assessed endpoints that looked at endpoints such as body weight, body length, and fetal growth. Many of the studies tracked these parameters across many stages of life, and this would allow for the critical evaluation of certain time points of exposure, and then being able to relate them back to later life impacts. A systematic review could also determine if there were similarities across species, since there were studies done in fish, rodents, humans, and chickens. Unfortunately, there were no studies to support potential findings at the mechanistic level. However, a systematic review could still be completed even without supporting mechanistic evidence. Next slide. For the reproductive category, there were studies that were done in both males and females. Endpoints included sperm count and motility, oocyte competence, and follicular atresia. In addition, there were a few studies that looked at hormone levels, steroid receptor expression, and steroid synthesizing enzyme expression. However, at the time of our review, we concluded that there may not be sufficient replication of endpoints across studies. And lastly, while models included rodents and chickens, there were no human studies. In this particular category of interesting notes, so after our paper was already in publication, another paper came out that assessed testosterone, luteinizing hormone, and steroidogenesis following melamine exposure. And this really just indicates how quickly this area of research is growing. Next slide. The neurophysiological endpoints seem to be most robust despite the lack of human studies. Most of the researchers evaluated hippocampal endpoints in both in vivo and in vitro models. There was replication across the endpoints, which is useful for systematic review. And in addition, there were many studies that assessed learning and memory in similar ways. So this area of research also had a really large body of mechanistic support, and we really liked it overall. So next slide. All right, so overall, the human data was lacking, even for our strongest candidates for systematic review. More human and mechanistic data would make for stronger systematic reviews of these outcomes. There were also areas of research that were not studied at all, such as cardiovascular and respiratory endpoints, and there were other areas that were studied less, like immune function. Next slide. Based on our analysis, we determined that neurophysiological, including some of the behavioral endpoints, would be the best candidate to move forward to systematic review in order to examine melamine's potential hazard to human health. Our final recommendations for our 3 candidates included more studies in humans and more mechanistic type studies for reproduction and anthropometric endpoints. And finally, we really encourage research that adds to the existing bodies of evidence over research efforts exploring endpoints that have not yet been evaluated in order to best protect human health. Next slide. So that is my presentation. I really want to take a second to thank my co-authors, Johanna Rochester and Carol Kwiatkowski. I also want to acknowledge our late founder, Theo Colborn and Lynn Carroll, as they were really instrumental in the early conception of this project. And finally, I want to thank Chris Ribbons, my behind-the-scenes hero. I mean, without her, this research really wouldn't be possible. And I also want to thank the funders here on the slides. And I would like to encourage you to follow us on Twitter at @Endo_exchange. And to also sign up for our mailing list to receive the latest and greatest on endocrine disruption research. Thanks.
Thanks, Ashley. Good timing. We've got lots of time for questions.
Yeah, awesome.
And I'm going to read them from the Q&A box, and you can just answer. And hopefully people can get into that on their Zoom screen and add questions for Ashley. So we have a couple so far. Has melamine been measured in humans, and at what concentrations? And specifically, do you know if it's measured in the NHANES data from the CDC?
Okay, that's a really, really good question. So I didn't mention it, but yes, we did find a study that found it in human urine samples. And it was really surprising, actually. They found it in 76% of the samples that had been measured. And I mean, of course, this is really interesting because, when you read further onto the paper, you find that the half-life of melamine is only a few hours. And so it was pretty surprising that they found it in 76% of human urine samples. And if I'm trying to recall correctly, it was sort of like in the lower nanogram per mil, so like maybe 2 or 3 nanograms per mil on that. And oh, you want to know about NHANES? Yes. I don't believe that it is measured in NHANES at this time, but that is something that I can definitely check up on, and I'd be happy to, if the person wants to reach out to me, I can email it over to them and let them know.
Okay, great. Another question: how long does melamine last in the body, and does it break down into anything else?
Yeah, that's a really awesome question. So the half-life is a few hours. Melamine itself, I believe it's like about 90% of it actually stays intact and is usually excreted through urine. It can also, if you're exposed, if the individual that is being exposed to the melamine has like high uric acid levels, or if they're also exposed to that cyanuric acid that we were talking about, then the melamine can crystallize with those chemicals and then create the kidney stones or the crystallization that we see in the kidneys.
Okay, great. We have another question. Have relevant effects been reported on fetal development?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. So the human study that we found actually did look at that a little bit. I believe that they were measuring things like body weight and growth. And so these studies were done in infants. I'm trying to remember if they looked at, I don't believe that they actually have looked at how in utero development impacts the fetus right when it's born. But there does seem to be changes in like infants and children. Yeah, that's what we pretty much know right now.
Okay, so we'll give it another minute and see if other people write in with questions. Since I was involved in this study, I just want to comment on the really surprising situation where 76% of the people that were measured in this one study had melamine in their bodies, and it is a body that's excreted relatively quickly, and we have very little information on how we're being exposed to it. So aside from the questions that we raised in our systematic or scoping review rather, about the health effects and wanting those to be studied further, this issue of exposure is really important that we start getting some answers in terms of, where and how it's being produced and how it could, permeate the environment enough to be in so many people. So I think that's really important. If anybody is out there is doing exposure research, we'd love your help.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think, I didn't really touch on it in the presentation, but I mean, I discussed possible exposure through food or from plates and cups and stuff, but there's also, the melamine is in floor and it's in a lot of the materials that are around the house. And I mean, no one has really looked at dust. And yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of space there to kind of ask those questions and figure it out.
Absolutely. Okay, we have another question. Is there exposure from food contact materials? What is the leaching?
Yeah, so there may be, in our research, what we found is we found studies that show that melamine can leach out of the plate, for example. And so basically what ends up happening is in order for them to make the melamine resin, they need to use a chemical reaction with melamine and formaldehyde. And so to get the melamine plate, that's what you have. And so when they do that research and they use like the simulated conditions where they were microwaving, or like I believe they were adding like hot water, or they were like adding stuff that had like a slightly acidic pH, they were finding in those samples the melamine and the formaldehyde both coming out of the food contact material. So this would be like out of the plate or the cup that they tested.
I think they found it in the utensils too.
Yeah, it's also in the utensils. It's in a lot of things. It's surprisingly in a lot of things. And it's, and I will just add to this also, there are also melamine containing flame retardants and antimicrobials. So, I mean, it's used in a lot of things.
Is it in other pesticides in addition to cyromazine?
I don't know the answer to that question. That's a really, really good question. And since it's used as a component of some antimicrobials, possibly, but I haven't heard of it being linked to any others.
A lot of potential exposure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have another question. Do we have a product or sector breakdown of melamine use?
Oh man, that is a very, very good question. I haven't come across one, but it would be great if someone could produce that. I mean, it'd be pretty sweet. I mean, it seems like it's just used in such a range of products. Yeah, so it's really interesting. Probably we would find like tons and tons of things.
I think a lot is being used in the building industry right now.
Yeah.
On the tops of desks and
Yep.
things like that. The
Yep.
coating has got melamine in it.
That's right. And it's in like whiteboards. And, as I mentioned, like laminate flooring, all of those things.
Yeah, the laminate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't see any more questions coming in. I want to thank you, Ashley, very much for your time and for your great presentation. Okay. So the person who questioned if we had a product or sector breakdown, Bev Thorpe, has responded saying a market breakdown exists, but it will be very costly to get, I bet.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of barriers to getting this
There are.
information, as we learned when we were working with Lizzie Grossman, trying
Yes,
to
that's true.
answers to questions. Yeah, it is fairly frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we'll wrap this up, and you can always email Ashley, or you can contact us through our contact page at TEDx.org. And I'll turn it back over to Maria. I want to thank you, Ashley.
Yeah,
do you have anything else you'd like to add before we close?
No, that's it. Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. And then Maria, I'll let you close the call.
Okay, thank you, Carol. We are approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on the CHE website soon. Tomorrow, you will receive an email containing a link to the recording. CHE's next webinar will take place Monday, December 4th, and is titled Toxic Threats to Children and Teens, Preconception and Prenatal. You can RSVP through CHE's website, healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events and more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website. Additionally, if you appreciate these CHE partnership webinars bringing you the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank our speaker, Ashley Bolden, for taking the time to present today, and Carol for her excellent moderation. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great day.